Zimbabwe has become the 28th country to join Africa50, an $871 million Pan-African private equity fund and key source of infrastructure investment on the continent. The government of Rwanda and Africa50 are exploring avenues of infrastructure financing and investment that could see Rwanda also become a beneficiary as well as an investor. For more on this special purpose vehicle for infrastructure financing in Africa, we're joined now by SABC East Africa correspondent Kimani, who is in Kigali. So let's just first start with that announcement by Zimbabwe becoming the 28th country to invest. So which other countries are there, and of what benefit is it to them specifically?
Well, maybe what I should talk about is the countries from the Southern African region that are members. There's only Malawi and Madagascar, and now Zimbabwe, bringing to 28 the countries that are members of what they call shareholders of the Africa50. But there are also countries from the East African region, from the Central African region, and also from the North African region. Other shareholders include the African Development Bank, the Central Bank of West Africa, and the Central Bank of Morocco.
So the summit itself, how much funding and commitment has it been able to net thus far?
Well, it has in its capital basket at least $800 million, but it hopes to raise that to $1 billion. So the entrance of Zimbabwe into the shareholders, among the shareholders, means it will continue to bridge that deficit, because what it intends to do is to increase the amount of money that the continent has to fund its infrastructure. As we speak now, every year the continent has a financing deficit of $108 billion. So for any country that comes in, then the African Development Bank and Africa50 is able to bridge that gap.
So are there particular areas earmarked for investments or industries that the FDB, for instance, is calling for more investment in?
Yes, especially the areas of energy, because according to the president of the African Development Bank, it is important that African countries invest in electricity. They say that the gap and the amount of energy that is needed in the continent is not enough, and that means manufacturing is low. That means even things like innovations cannot take place, and that is why then they are fighting to see to it that there is more energy investments. Indeed, they have now solar power projects in Egypt, in Senegal, and in Cameroon. But probably the most exciting is they're going to be doing a bridge, a railroad bridge that will connect the Congo, Congo-Brazzaville as we know it, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. Since independence, these two countries do not have a way of moving from one country to another unless through the waters in rickety boats, which sometimes cause a lot of deaths. We've seen that in the news, or via air. So this is going to be an exciting one, almost similar to the one that connected Senegal and Gambia, what is known as the Senegambia Bridge. There is also natural gas, but also one of the things that they will be looking at is innovation. So they're talking about the Kigali Innovation City as a startup, and then they're going to have many more, because they believe now the economies will be digital, and so they need to drag the economies more towards innovation.
So speaking about what has already been invested, the FDB president talking about bankable projects, but as you mentioned, a list of what has already been signed up for. I'm thinking of projects that are long, 10, 15 years already in the pipeline, in the blue economy, in the ICT. You spoke about, we'll look at Kenya to South Africa, Mozambique, Malawi, etc., all of those areas. So how are Africans going to be convinced that there are indeed bankable projects, worthy projects of 10, 15 years down the line? We haven't really, enjoyed the benefits of some of these projects.
I think it will start to make sense once the African Continental Free Trade Area takes effect. Already it has been launched, but once people realize that they cannot move their goods from country A to country B via road, because the roads are non-existent, or the time takes too long because it would have been easier to use a cargo train, but the railway infrastructure is not there, then it will start to make sense to governments, and governments will indeed find that they have no choice but to join Africa50 or to indeed begin, doing cross-border infrastructure. So this is what Akiwumi Adesina was talking about, that if the African Continental Free Trade Area is to become make sense and be implemented in a way that then it begins to reap benefits for Africans, then infrastructure will be key.
And there was a great deal of concern about how long it will take for Nigeria, for instance, to come to the party. That was recently announced that they are going to be part of the African Free Trade Agreement and among the implementers. How many countries remain, and what was said about the agreement at the summit?
Well, in terms of the African Continental Free Trade Area, we just have Eritrea that has not signed, but several countries still have not ratified. But at least by the time they were launching, we had reached the threshold that was needed for 22 countries. In terms of the Africa50, so far we have only 28 countries that are shareholders, meaning we still have just over 27 countries, about 26 countries that are still not members, meaning these countries cannot reap the benefits that come with being members of Africa50, which is being helped to identify and fund bankable infrastructure projects in their countries. And so when Zimbabwe was signing in, the president of the African Development Bank, who's also the chairman of Africa50, was clear that it would be important for all countries, all African countries, to join so that then they can start to reap the benefits. But also, he spoke about looking for money away from just Africa. So he was talking about sovereign wealth funds, African ones, which are investing outside, and saying there's more than $3 trillion in those funds. How can we get that money back into Africa to start doing infrastructure? Because it will also reap benefits for those countries that invest in infrastructure.
And what about the continent's regional blocs? We spoke about some of them who are investors in Africa50. East Africa, obviously, amongst the growing regional blocs. When we speak about Rwanda's roles, how many are looking to be investors or shareholders, do we know?
Yes, the East African region is doing well. The Central African region is doing well. The North African region is also doing very well. The concern for Africa50 is that the Southern African region has lagged behind, despite the fact that their board members, like there is a South African who right now on our screens, who is a board member, but South Africa is still not a board is still not a shareholder. And you would imagine that South Africa's being a shareholder would be very important because they need to bring in the much needed capital. And so the African Development Bank says it's still talking to governments to see what happens. But they're very also clear that they're prioritizing on landlocked countries. There are 18 landlocked countries in Africa, and that means these countries cannot be able to export and all that. And so they have to depend, take for example, Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, and Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo. All of them have to either depend on Kenya, the port of Mombasa, or depend on Tanzania, the port of Dar es Salaam. So the African Development Bank, through Africa50, will be trying to see how does it connect these landlocked countries to the ports that are near it, or even just through road, to make it easier for them to be able to do business with each other.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Sarah Kimani, our East Africa correspondent, speaking to us from Kigali in Rwanda, where the summit is taking place.